questioning the evilness of his system, but of wanting to share in it. We never had a national debate. Who gave the NAACP the permission to go out to court and talk for black people in terms of equality? Equality with whom? We should have debated that. That's a moral issue. Equality with the slave master? Equality with exploiters? Equality with people who, every time they stepped on a continent, destroyed and degraded the people that they dealt with? Is this what we want, a sharing of the spoils? Or is it that we want a whole different world than what these people have bought on this earth today? But we were diverted from asking that fundamental question. We were made to think simply because we were getting paid less than white folk, our problem would be solved merely by getting equal pay. But the problem is much deeper than that, ladies and gentlemen. But that too is a part of the illness, you see. So then the maladjustment is used and is induced in the African to engage in self-destructive behavior so that he may annihilate himself, or that his demise can be permitted or enacted without triggering Eurocentric guilt and without costly resistance. It was induced to permit the European to perceive himself as naturally superior, to protect the European from genetic annihilation. While I'm on that subject, let me just mention one quick thing here about genetic annihilation. Some of you saw this, I'm sure. U.S. News and World Report, June 22nd, 1987. What does it say here? Are we having enough babies? You know whose question that could be. Of course, this is a piece done by Ben Wattenberg. Some of you might have seen him at various places, and he's doing a very interesting thing now. He wrote a book called The Birth Dearth, indicating, of course, that not enough white people are being produced in the world. And so he starts saying, what's happening today has never happened before. It will dramatically change the U.S. and the world in which we live. Over the years, I've heard businessmen, diplomats, government planners, and parents all begging for the same thing. No surprises, please. This book, a speculation about the future based on current trends, is an attempt to deal with that plaint. Forewarned is forearmed. What is happening is this. For about a decade and a half, the peoples of the free, modern, industrial world, that includes the U.S., have not born enough children to reproduce themselves over an extended period of time. We had a baby boom, but now there is a birth dearth. I believe that the birth dearth will, in the near future, begin to cause turbulence at every level of our economy. I believe, too, that the birth dearth will leave in its wake tens of millions of unhappy adults who will end up with no children at all, or fewer children than they really wanted, or no grandchildren, or fewer grandchildren than they had hoped for. I believe the demographic and immigration patterns inherent in the birth dearth will yield an even smaller proportion of Americans of white European stock. This will likely cause more ethnic and racial tension and turmoil than otherwise would occur. That's you see. People concerned with what? Their genes, maintaining their ethnicity, seeing it as an important factor, not trying to obliterate it the way we and our assimilationist people have tried to do, not trying to forget who they are, but trying to hold on to their identity. This is one of the challenges of Afrocentric education, by the way. And one of the things that we have to look at, what would happen if these Europeans begin to disappear from the face of the earth? What will happen if they decide that they are not going to disappear and want to make some other people disappear? How are they going to deal with their low birth rate? What are the political implications about that situation? It has very serious implications for African people. And these people are now getting ready to deal with it. I believe further, he says, that the birth dearth may well turn out to be of great harm to the broadest value we treasure. It will make it difficult to promote and defend liberty in Western nations and the rest of the modernized world. Talking about white folk, certainly could be talking about us in terms of liberty. Primacy and prosperity. And he's talking about here, we live in a community of free and modern nations banded together in a loose but real alliance. These nations like to argue. They argue about strategic defense, about who will buy cars from whom, and about whose wine shall be subject to what countervailing duties. But beneath the bickering, something remarkable has happened during the last four decades. This community of free modern nations has shaped and molded the nature of the entire world. A direct admission of their role in the world, you see. We've shaped and what? Created the world. Now that is being what? Threatened. And what are we going to do about maintaining it? You think that these people are going to let you free? You got another thought coming. Economically, technologically, culturally, geopolitically, and in many ways militarily as well. In other words, we've shaped it militarily as well. It's interesting sometimes when I see the Europeans talk about their boys being killed, and of course I was being killed along with them. They talk about gets being robbed, and others being robbed. But remember one thing, if you're being held up out there in the streets by knife or gun, it's a gun you sold to them. And if black boys and white boys are being killed in Southeast Asia, 9 times out of 10 they are killed by weapons sold to the very people that are killing them. Ye that what lives by the sword shall what? Die by it. You think you can go around the world selling billions and millions of dollars of jet planes and weapons and not yourself ultimately be victimized by the very things you sell? These sellers of death will ultimately be the main victims of their own tools of death. By 1950, when this Western moment was in its early days, the population of the free modern world comprised about 22% of the global population. That's amazing even at that, isn't it? That 22% of the population could have control over another, 88%. Today we are 15%. By the year 2030, we will be 9%. A reasonable extrapolation to the end of the next century brings the Western proportion down to about what? 5%. But we still want to be in control. A question arises, will our values continue to dominate in the world where our population shrinks to 9%, shrinks to 5%, even lower? And he goes on to talk about population and power. Can you see again? Let's look up, I hope I'm not holding you up too long. I'll be through shortly. I just want to make a few other quotes from this. What happens when the West is less than 10% of the world, less than 5%? Do mere numbers of people equate with power and influence? Consider first the military situation. There are populous nations that are not big powers, China and India, but only populous nations can become big powers. The United States and the Soviet Union. The advantage of a large labor force and economies of scale are of vast importance. Brute economic production is one critical aspect of national strength and security. Larger populations can build more easily the infrastructure that supports national defense. And attaining technological leadership requires a large critical mass of scientists. Can we begin to see now why you cannot produce a large number of black engineers and technological people? Why the African world must remain ununited and disunited? Because these people recognize quite clearly that the uniting of African people, the social organization of African people, the social and economic networking of African people spells the end of European power and dominance. It's stated right here that, do you ever think, and I know it must amaze you at times, of the influence that Jewish people have in the world. I read with great dismay here about 2 weeks ago the demands that they were laying on the Pope, and how they had the Pope going. It's an interesting situation. And yet you think about it, there are only about, 15 million of them in the world? Maybe even less. And yet, there's a major Jewish political organization in Washington that literally vetoes everything that the United States government does. That the United States budget itself is submitted to this organization. That this organization literally determines who and what nations and what groups will get what from this United States, even though this group is less than 3% of the United States population, ladies and gentlemen. It's an amazing situation there. Here are a people, population-wise, are are smaller than a gnat. When you compare them with something like, what, 400 million or more African people, or more than 500 million Indian people, more than about 1 billion Chinese, and you can name one major population after another, and yet these billions somehow are unable to control their circumstances, and a tiny little group is able to literally manipulate this country and influence what goes on in the world. Reminds me of something some of you read today in today's New York Times. You heard about Mr. Le Pen over there in France, running for office, very famous because he wants to run the Africans and the Asians out of France. Wasn't doing too bad either. Jean-Marie Le Pen, France's leading far-right politician and candidate for the French presidency, has caused an uproar with the statement that the Nazi gas chambers were a minor point of history. No problem until he mentioned that. Several political figures said that they would even vote to lift Mr. Le Pen's parliamentary immunity so that a defamation lawsuit could be brought against him. Political analysts and politicians said this was the first major slip, note that is first major slip by Mr. Le Pen, whose political campaign focuses on reducing the number of Africans, African Asians, and Arab immigrants to keep France French. So that wasn't his first major slip. It was only when he related to the Jews that he really made it, and that really cooked his goose. As long as he inveighed against Africans and others, as long as he talked about keeping them out and denying them, no problem. As a matter of fact, he was ascending in French politics. As long as he wanted to keep French, all of France, French, and all of that, no problem, no major issue. I mean, no major slip. But as soon as he said this business about the gas chambers and how Jews were executed might be a minor point in history, he was in serious trouble. This is the first major mistake Mr. Le Pen has committed, because these ideas that everyone thought, these are the ideas that everyone thought were dead. Political analysts also said Mr. Le Pen's remarks would probably make it harder for Mr. Chirac's coalition to agree to cooperate with Mr. Le Pen to help defeat the Socialist Party in next year's election. In other words, you see, you can help determine the shape of our government as long as you stay off the large majorities in the world. And just stay off of the what? The minority, the true minority in the world. As long as you can defame black people and African people, you can help determine the shape of the European government, of the French government. But as soon as you then talk about a very small minority in the world, you have made a major misstep, and you will pay for a very interesting kind of situation there. However, despite all of this, they ultimately recognize that if large populations were truly to unite and were truly to develop a national consciousness, were truly to approach the world in terms of cultural and nationalistic interests, they recognize ultimately then the power would have to shift. And of course we know then that is one of the major reasons why the European must minorize large groups of people and must make people who are ethnically the same think of themselves as being ethnically different. On a larger consumer market, only a larger consumer market can support much broad-based industrial scientific innovation, which often spins off into the military field. And he goes on and talks about, later on he talks about, and culture counts. Values count. If the peoples of the world admire Western values and seek to adopt them, we are what? Stronger and safer. So you think then, with this kind of attitude, that African values will be permitted to flourish among African people if we leave it up to them to determine what values are there? There is another to be poor. Blacks and Hispanics have higher fertility rates than whites, although middle-class blacks have lower fertility rates than middle-class whites. Very interesting situation there as well. Have we, as black people, been so concerned with living in a European lifestyle that we've given up reproduction? Yet, many of us who are in the so-called middle class have done exactly that. This situation also illustrates the very deadly nature of European society and its very opposition to African values. You must recognize when you read Freudian psychology, at the bottom of that psychology is a critique of European society. A society that comes to hate sex. A society that sees sexuality as its enemy, as in opposition to civilization. A society that denies its gods sex and sexuality is a society ultimately that's going to be a deadly one. How can you have fear and hatred and antipathy toward the very source of life and not ultimately side with death itself? And I think one of the major reasons this society has become deadly and a threat to the life of the very world itself is that it has problems with its own sexuality. And it has problems with the very basic nature of man. It has such a problem then that those who have the most to give to children, you would think, in terms of wealth, knowledge, and so forth, are the very ones that what? Do not have them. There's a problem there, ladies and gentlemen. And it's interesting to note then that this is diametrically opposed to the African sense and to African values that look at life and growth and development as a great value. But yet we note as African adopts these European values, they will also adopt the deadly nature of Europeans to the point often of killing their own children or denying them birth or denying them conception in the first place. And now the European is beginning to see the result of the philosophy that they have put forth. What happens in America? He goes, and it's interesting to know that this is one of the challenges. Further, recent immigrants have higher fertility rates than other Americans. By the way, some of you might have read 2 or 3 years ago about the browning of America. The idea that the Hispanics are moving in so rapidly that at the rate they're going, they'll soon be America's largest minority. There will be more Hispanics in this country than blacks. And that at the rate they're going, we'll literally have a brown America. That's a major question we have to deal with too, ladies and gentlemen, by the way. What will happen to the black population in this country as it is outnumbered by the Hispanic population? Or as it is balanced off by Asian immigration? That's a challenge that our children must be educated to meet. I know it's a question we hate to deal with. And often we want to lump a lot of problems onto white and non-white, forgetting, though, that we as people have to compete against all people on this earth. Africa has to compete against Latin America as well for markets in this United States and other places. And we have to compete with other non-white people. And the idea then that we just cannot let then other non-white people just function the way they want to without also looking at it in terms of what it means in terms of our own self-development, growth, and survival as a people. The influx then of Hispanics in this family, in this country, will have a major impact upon the quality of black life in this country. And I think those of you who, of course, go in the black community can already see that. Those of you who may go to Miami can already see it in very clear terms. And in certain parts of New Jersey can see it. And yet it's an issue that we don't want to face. The rate is less than that if illegal immigrants are counted. That and let me go back. Today, fewer than 20% of legal immigrants to America are of white European stock. The rate is even less than that if illegal immigrants are counted in. There is little reason to think this will change. Birth rates in Western Europe are so low these days, there's hardly anyone left to leave. In other words, there are hardly any whites to come over anymore. Today, about 80% of the current total United States population is of white European stock. At roughly current rates of fertility and immigration, demographers Leon have projected that by the year 2080, the white European share of the U.S. population will be down to 60% and will be shrinking. With the higher rate of immigration, it will only be 50%. Very interesting. Reminds me of that movie, War of the Worlds, you know. When it looked like the aliens were taking over, and then they died because of disease. Will the European die out? Will our problem be solved by their mere death? While we may take some pride in that, if they don't increase the rate of babies they're having, we may be faced with another problem, though. Are we to get the European off of our backs, only to have the Asian and others on our backs? So the idea that the European may die away or fade away should not give us too much relief, because we are still faced with the challenge of other groups exploiting us as well. What happens in America with birth conditions under these scenarios? I think it will yield some unnecessary social turbulence. We can see then that the inducement of inferiority in black people, the inducement of a feeling of otherness, the inducement of these various negative feelings